I want to begin by explaining something that might seem obvious but is worth stating clearly. When we talk about atheism, we're talking about a position on a single question. Do gods exist? The atheist answers no, or at least I see no convincing reason to think so. That's all atheism really is. It's not a complete worldview, not a rigid philosophy, not a statement about morality or meaning or how we should live. It's simply the absence of belief in deities. Everything else I might say about how I understand the world, how I try to make sense of things, comes from other sources. Science, yes, but also reason, compassion, experience, and the recognition that we're part of something vast and ancient and entirely natural. Now, why don't I believe in gods? The simplest answer is this: I've never encountered evidence that would justify such a belief. But that answer, while honest, doesn't really illuminate much, does it? It's worth exploring further because the reasons for disbelief are far more interesting than the simple statement of it. They involve biology, cosmology, history, psychology, and perhaps most fascinating of all, the very human tendency to see patterns and intentions where none actually exist. Let me start with what we know about the universe, and I promise I'll try not to make this sound like a textbook. We live on a small planet orbiting an unremarkable star in a galaxy containing hundreds of billions of stars, and that galaxy is just one among hundreds of billions of galaxies. When I first really absorbed that fact, I mean really let it sink in, it was both humbling and oddly exhilarating. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Our planet formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Life emerged not long after, perhaps 3.5 billion years ago, beginning as simple self-replicating molecules. Over unimaginable stretches of time, through the blind, pitiless, but also strangely creative process of natural selection, those simple forms gave rise to the spectacular diversity of life we see today. This includes us, human beings, who appeared only in the last few 100,000 years, a mere blink in geological time. This isn't speculation or philosophical musing. This is what the evidence tells us when we actually look at it. The fossil record, radiometric dating, the distribution of species across continents, the nested hierarchies we find in DNA, the observed mutations and adaptations we can watch happening in laboratories and in nature, all of it points to the same conclusion. Life evolved. We are descended from earlier forms and those from still earlier forms in an unbroken line stretching back billions of years to the origin of life itself. We are, quite literally, cousins to every living thing on Earth. We share ancestors with oak trees, with mushrooms, with bacteria. I know that sounds strange, perhaps even uncomfortable, but it's a fact as well established as the fact that the Earth orbits the Sun. When I look at this picture, when I really absorb what science has revealed about our origins and our place in the cosmos, I find no need for supernatural explanations. The universe doesn't appear designed for us. In fact, it appears spectacularly indifferent to us. The vast majority of it would kill us instantly. Even on our own planet, most of its history passed without us. 99% of all species that ever lived are now extinct. If this is design, it's extraordinarily wasteful and frankly quite cruel. Consider the human body itself, often cited as evidence of intelligent design. I've heard this argument countless times, and I understand why it's appealing. We are remarkable creatures, but look closer and you'll find the body is nothing like what an omnipotent designer would create. Our eyes have a blind spot where the optic nerve passes through the retina, a clumsy arrangement that no engineer would approve. The recurrent laryngeal nerve takes an absurd detour down into the chest and back up to the larynx, a route that makes sense only when you understand our evolutionary history. As a remnant of our fish ancestry, we give birth through a birth canal that's barely adequate, a consequence of our relatively recent evolution toward upright walking and large brains. We choke on food because the same passage serves both breathing and eating. Our knees wear out, our backs ache. We get wisdom teeth that don't fit properly in our jaws. These aren't the hallmarks of omnipotent design, they're the telltale signs of tinkering, of modification upon modification, each generation building on what came before, with no foresight, no grand plan, only the immediate pressure of survival and reproduction. Evolution by natural selection is not a theory in the casual sense of a guess or hunch. It's a theory in the scientific sense, a comprehensive explanation supported by vast quantities of evidence from multiple independent sources. It explains why life looks designed without requiring a designer. It explains the patterns we see in nature, the adaptations, the extinctions, the geographical distribution of species, why marsupials are found in Australia, why island species differ from mainland species. It makes predictions that can be tested and have been confirmed again and again. It's as close to certain as science gets, up there with the germ theory of disease and the atomic theory of matter. And here's the crucial point. Once you understand evolution, really understand it, the need for a creator to explain life simply evaporates. The appearance of design is explained by the accumulation of tiny changes over millions of generations, each change either helping or hindering survival. Complex organs like eyes didn't appear fully formed, like pulling a rabbit from a hat. They evolved gradually, step by step, each intermediate stage conferring some small advantage. We can trace these pathways, we can see them in the fossil record and in the comparative anatomy of living species. We can even observe evolution happening in real time right now, in bacteria developing antibiotic resistance, in viruses mutating, in populations adapting to new environments. It's happening all around us. But perhaps you're thinking, gee, all right, evolution explains life on Earth, but what about the universe itself? What about the Big Bang? Doesn't that require a first cause, a creator to light the blue touch paper and set it all in motion? This is a natural question, one I've grappled with myself, but it rests on a misunderstanding. Asking what came before the Big Bang may be like asking what's north of the North Pole. The question doesn't quite make sense. Time itself appears to have begun with the Big Bang. The question of what caused it may not even be meaningful in the usual sense. Moreover, even if we grant that the universe had a beginning, and that beginnings require causes, why should that cause be a god, let alone the specific god of any particular religion? Why not some natural process we don't yet understand? Why not a quantum fluctuation, a budding from another universe, something entirely beyond our current physics? We simply don't know yet, and that's okay. Saying I don't know is more honest than inserting a deity into the gap in our knowledge. Throughout history, gods have been invoked to explain what we didn't understand: thunder, lightning, disease, the motion of planets, why crops failed, why children died. As our understanding grew, those gods retreated. The god of the gaps gets smaller with each scientific advance. It's a pattern we've seen repeated so many times that we should perhaps be suspicious of continuing it. Let me turn to another aspect of this question, one that troubles me deeply, the problem of suffering. If there were an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, we would expect a very different universe than the one we actually observe. We see vast suffering, not just in humans, but throughout the animal kingdom. Animals eat each other alive. Parasites consume their hosts from within, sometimes keeping them alive for weeks. As they're devoured, natural disasters kill indiscriminately. Children die of disease and starvation through no fault of their own or anyone else's. The world is red in tooth and claw, exactly as we would expect from a process driven by differential survival, and nothing like what we'd expect from benevolent design. The usual response is that suffering exists because of free will, or because it builds character, or because we simply can't understand God's mysterious ways. But these responses don't hold up to scrutiny. Most suffering has nothing whatsoever to do with free will. A child born with a painful genetic disease hasn't chosen anything. An animal torn apart by predators hasn't made a moral error. Victims of earthquakes and tsunamis haven't exercised poor judgment. And the suggestion that we must simply accept that God's ways are mysterious is really an admission that the facts don't fit the theory. If you have to invoke mystery to explain why the evidence contradicts your belief, perhaps it's the belief itself that needs examining. I want to be absolutely clear about something. I'm not saying religious people are stupid or immoral or deluded. Many of the most brilliant, compassionate people I've known or read about have held religious beliefs. But I am saying the beliefs themselves don't withstand scrutiny when examined with the same rigor we apply to other claims about reality. Faith, by definition, is belief without sufficient evidence, or even in spite of evidence. It's considered a virtue in religious contexts, something to be admired and praised, but in any other domain of life, we recognize this as credulity. If someone told you they had an invisible dragon in their garage that couldn't be detected by any means, that left no evidence of its presence, you'd be right to be skeptical, no matter how sincerely they believed it, no matter how much comfort that belief gave them, Now, you might ask, where does morality come from, if not from God? I hear this question often, and it reveals a common misconception. Morality is not a mystery requiring supernatural explanation. It's a product of our evolution as social animals. We evolved in groups. Our survival depended on cooperation, on trust, on working together. We developed emotions like empathy, guilt, and shame because they helped us navigate complex social relationships. We have a sense of fairness, of reciprocity, of care for our children and those close to us, because these traits enhanced our ancestors' chances of survival and reproduction. Different cultures have developed different moral codes, that's true, but they also have remarkable similarities, and those similarities reflect our common evolutionary heritage. Murder, theft, and lying are condemned in virtually every society because societies where these behaviors were tolerated simply couldn't function and fell apart. We don't need ancient texts to tell us that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong. We can figure this out through reason, through empathy, through considering the consequences of our actions. In fact, our moral progress, such as the abolition of slavery, the expansion of rights to women and minorities, the recognition of animal welfare, has of 10 required us to move beyond what those ancient texts actually say and sometimes explicitly command. What about meaning and purpose? Doesn't atheism leave us adrift in a cold, purposeless universe? Yes, the universe itself is indifferent. It has no cosmic purpose for us written in the stars, but that doesn't mean our lives lack meaning or that we're condemned to despair. We create meaning through our relationships, our work, our art, our attempts to understand the world and reduce suffering where we can. The meaning we make for ourselves is, I'd argue, more authentic than any imposed from above by divine decree. We're free to choose what matters to us, to decide what kind of life is worth living. That's not bleak or depressing. That's liberating. It means we get to write our own story. I sometimes hear that atheism leads inevitably to nihilism or immorality, but the evidence doesn't support this claim at all. Societies with higher rates of atheism, like those in Scandinavia, tend to be more peaceful, more equitable, with lower rates of violent crime and higher levels of well-being. This isn't an argument for atheism exactly, but it does counter the claim that belief in God is necessary for moral behavior or human flourishing. In fact, I'd suggest that when people do good because they think they're being watched by a cosmic judge, that's not morality in the deepest sense. It's obedience, it's prudence, it's enlightened self-interest. True morality is doing right because you understand why it's right, because you genuinely care about the well-being of others, not because you fear punishment or crave reward in an afterlife. Let me address another common question, one that T's posed as a sort of trump card. What if you're wrong? What if there is a God and you face judgment after death? This is Pascal's wager, the idea that you might as well believe in God because if you're right, you gain eternal bliss, and if you're wrong, you've lost nothing. But this reasoning is deeply flawed. First, you can't simply choose to believe something. Belief isn't an act of will. I can't just decide to believe in Zeus or Thor or the flying spaghetti monster, and neither can you. You can pretend, you can go through the motions, but genuine belief isn't something you switch on. Second, which God should I believe in? There have been thousands of gods worshipped throughout human history. If I pick the wrong one, I might be in as much trouble as if I'd picked none at all. Third, if there were a God worth worshipping, surely that God would value honest inquiry over feigned belief. An omniscient being would see through the pretense. I want to talk for a moment about the origins of religious belief, because understanding this helps explain why these ideas are so persistent, so widespread, despite the lack of evidence. Our brains evolved in a particular environment to solve particular problems, and they developed certain shortcuts that usually worked well enough. We evolved to detect patterns and agents. On the African savannah, where our ancestors lived, it was better to mistake a shadow for a predator than to mistake a predator for a shadow. The cost of a false positive, being needlessly alarmed, was small compared to the cost of a false negative, being eaten. So we became very good at seeing patterns, sometimes even when they're not really there. We see faces in clouds. We hear voices in the wind. We find meaningful coincidences in random events. We also evolved to attribute intentionality, to assume that events happen because someone or something made them happen. When our ancestors heard a rustle in the grass, those who assumed it was an agent with intentions, perhaps a predator or an enemy, survived more often than those who assumed it was just the wind. Better safe than sorry. This hair-trigger agency detection served us well in a dangerous world, but it also made us prone to seeing invisible agents everywhere, controlling the weather, causing disease, demanding worship. These cognitive tendencies made us naturally prone to supernatural thinking. We see the order in nature and assume there must be a divine orderer. We experience consciousness and assume there must be a cosmic consciousness. We feel that our lives have meaning, and we project that feeling onto the universe itself. We're uncomfortable with randomness and death, so we invent stories about higher purposes and afterlives. Religion is, in many ways, a natural outgrowth of how our minds work, shaped by the same evolutionary forces that shaped everything else about us. Understanding this doesn't make religion go away, but it does help explain why these beliefs feel so compelling, so natural, even without evidence. Children are especially prone to this kind of thinking, which is partly why religious ideas are so often transmitted from parents to children before critical faculties have fully developed. A child who trusts what their parents tell them, who doesn't question authority, is more likely to survive than one who questions everything and wanders off. But this me trust, this same acceptance, makes children vulnerable to believing whatever they're taught, whether it's true or not. Most people believe in the religion they happen to be born into, which strongly suggests that religious belief has more to do with geography and culture than with any underlying truth about the universe. None of this proves that gods don't exist. I want to be careful here. You can't prove a negative. I can't prove there's no Zeus atop Mount Olympus any more than I can prove there's no teapot orbiting the sun somewhere beyond Mars. But the burden of proof lies with those making the positive claim. If you claim a God exists, it's up to you to provide evidence. Absence of evidence isn't absolute proof of absence, I grant you that, but it's certainly reason for skepticism, especially when we're talking about extraordinary claims. What I can say is this: every claim that can be tested, every religious assertion about the physical world has either been refuted or remains without any supporting evidence. The Earth isn't 6,000 years old, it's 4.5 billion. Humans didn't appear fully formed from dust or clay. We evolved from earlier primates over millions of years. Prayers don't cure disease at rates any different from placebo. Miraculous claims, when investigated, invariably dissolve under scrutiny or turn out to have natural explanations. The sacred texts of various religions are filled with historical errors, internal contradictions, and moral teachings that we've rightly moved beyond. They're interesting as historical documents, as literature, as windows into how ancient people thought and what they valued, but they're not reliable guides to reality. I find the natural world, honestly understood, far more awe-inspiring than any supernatural claim. The fact that we're made of atoms forged in the hearts of dying stars, that we share an ancestor with every living thing on Earth, that the light reaching our eyes from distant galaxies has traveled for billions of years, these are profound truths that fill me with genuine wonder. Reality is extraordinary enough, strange enough, beautiful enough, without needing to embellish it with myths. I recognize that many people find real comfort in religious belief. They find community, ritual, a sense of connection to something larger than themselves, answers to difficult questions. I don't dismiss these needs, they're genuine and important. But there are secular ways to meet them. We can build communities around shared values and interests. We can create rituals that mark important life transitions, celebrate achievements, mourn losses. We can feel awe and connection when we contemplate the cosmos, when we lose ourselves in music or art, when we work together toward common goals. We don't need supernatural beliefs to live meaningful, connected, fulfilling lives. I also want to acknowledge that letting go of religious belief can be difficult, even painful. For many people, it means questioning what they've been taught since childhood, what their families believe, what gives structure and comfort to their lives. It can feel like losing something precious, like being cast adrift. I understand that. But I'd argue that what you gain is more valuable in the long run: intellectual honesty, freedom from dogma, the ability to question and explore without guilt, and a clear view of reality as it actually is, not as we might wish it to be, There's a kind of courage in facing the universe without comforting illusions, in accepting our mortality without the promise of an afterlife. Science doesn't have all the answers, and it never will. There are questions that may lie forever beyond our reach. We may never know what, if anything, came before the Big Bang. We may never fully understand consciousness. But the wonderful thing about science is that it's a self-correcting process. When new evidence comes in, we change our minds. Theories are modified or discarded. We admit when we don't know something, and we're comfortable with uncertainty. This intellectual humility, this willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it's uncomfortable, is the opposite of faith, which demands belief regardless of evidence. I sometimes hear that science is just another kind of faith, but this is simply wrong. Science is based on evidence, on testable predictions, on reproducible results. If you don't believe in gravity, you can perform experiments. If you don't believe in evolution, you can examine fossils, you can study DNA sequences, you can observe populations changing over time. Science invites skepticism. It demands scrutiny. That's how it progresses. Religion, in contrast, discourages questioning and rewards blind acceptance. Doubt is a virtue in science and a sin in religion. As I come to the end of these reflections, I want to emphasize that I don't claim absolute certainty about any of this. I can't prove gods don't exist any more than you can prove invisible unicorns don't exist. But I can say that I've looked at the evidence as honestly as I can. I've considered the arguments from all sides, and I find no good reason to believe. The universe we observe is exactly the universe we'd expect if there were no supernatural intelligence guiding it. It's ancient, vast, mostly empty, governed by natural laws that we're slowly uncovering through patient observation and experiment. We're a curious species, one that evolved the capacity to ask big questions, to wonder about our origins and our place in the cosmos. For most of our history, we lacked the tools to answer those questions properly, so we made up stories. Those stories served important functions. They bound communities together, provided comfort in the face of death and uncertainty, gave people a sense of purpose and belonging. I don't begrudge our ancestors those stories, but now we have better tools. We have science. We can trace our lineage back through time. We can peer into the distant past and the far reaches of space. We can explain so much that once seemed miraculous or mysterious. Perhaps one day we'll discover evidence that changes everything, that points unmistakably to some kind of creative intelligence behind the universe. If that day comes, if the evidence is genuinely compelling, I'll change my mind. That's what it means to think rationally, to care about truth more than comfort. But until then, I see no reason to believe in gods, and every reason to marvel at the natural all in all its terrible beauty and indifferent grandeur. We're here for a brief moment in cosmic time, conscious matter contemplating its own existence, and that seems remarkable enough to me. We don't need to add gods to make it more remarkable. We just need to pay attention to what's actually here.